The screams echoed through the streets of Visburg. The first body was found slumped in an alley, as cold as marble. The second lay curled in her doorway, her eyes wide and frozen in horror. Then came the rats. They poured from the shadows, hundreds of them, their slick bodies swarming through the streets. Stefan knew what it meant. For years, the villagers had feared the castle looming above them. The sickness always came from there, the disappearances, the bodies drained of blood. But no one had dared to stop it, until now. Torches flickered as Stefan led two others, Lucas and Hans, up the path to the castle. The gates were open. "That's odd. They're never open," Hans muttered. Lucas swallowed. "Maybe someone else went in first." Stefan tightened his grip on the hammer at his waist. "Then we'll see for ourselves." He stepped forward. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then shadows moved. A shape emerged from the darkness. Something snatched Lucas, and the sound of tearing flesh filled the air. A second later, his body hit the ground. His chest was ripped open. Hans turned to run, but something caught him by the throat. Stefan raised his torch, and for the first time, he saw it. A horrifically thin figure, eyes black as the abyss, reflecting no light, no soul. A grin stretched across its corpse-like face, revealing fangs too long, too sharp. Hans let out a choked sound as the creature's mouth opened wide. Then it bit down. Stefan didn't wait. He ran. The last thing he heard was Hans gurgling on his own blood. Lenora had never feared the dark. She had spent her life chasing her dreams, playing in candlelit concert halls, composing through sleepless nights. So when she received a letter inviting her to perform at a castle for a wealthy patron, she ignored the villagers' warnings. The sum offered was extraordinary, but the moment she arrived, something felt wrong. The castle's gates stood open, as if expecting her. As she entered, the air was stale, thick with dust and something that smelled faintly of decay. Then she saw him. The Count stood at the end of the hall, beside a grand piano. He was tall and lanky. His eyes, hollow and black as death, gleamed in the candlelight.
"You have come,"
he murmured. "Yes," she managed to say. A long, heavy silence followed. Lenora expected him to say more, but the Count simply watched her. With a slow breath, she stepped toward the piano. The keys were cold beneath her fingertips. Then she played. The music stretched through the vast emptiness of the castle. The Count stood too still, listening with an intensity that made her skin crawl.
"I have waited for someone like you,"
he murmured. His fingers twitched as if resisting the urge to touch her. Lenora stood abruptly. "I think I'll turn in for the night." The Count smiled.
"Yes, rest. You will need it,"
he whispered. Lenora forced a smile, nodding stiffly as she turned away. She climbed the staircase and felt his eyes on her the entire way. Her room was lavish but cold. The bed was large, but the sheets smelled stale. She closed the door and made sure it was locked. The weight of exhaustion pulled at her, but sleep felt impossible in a place like this. She lay down, curling beneath the heavy blankets. Eventually, her breathing slowed, her mind drifted, and then a sound. Her eyes snapped open. The candle by her bedside had gone out. Something moved. She turned her head, then she saw him, standing at the foot of her bed, watching. The Count tilted his head.
"You are unlike the others.
He whispered. Lenora couldn't breathe.
You will not wither so easily."
Something inside her snapped. She threw herself off the bed, scrambling backward, her hands fumbling for the door. The lock wouldn't turn. Behind her, the Count took a step forward.
"You belong to me now."
he murmured. Lenora pounded on the door, desperate. The Count moved again. Then the lock clicked. Lenora wrenched it open and stumbled into the hallway. She didn't stop to question it. She ran. The corridors twisted in the dark, stretching longer than before. She didn't know where she was going. She turned a corner and froze. A door stood open. A gust of air rolled out from the dark, carrying a scent that made her stomach turn. And then a noise. A voice, weak, broken. Lenora's hands clenched into fists. She stepped forward. The chamber was small, walls lined with crumbling stone. And in the center, a man slumped against the wall. His skin was pale, his veins blackened, as if the blood had been rotting inside him. His eyes fluttered open at the sound of her footsteps. Lenora staggered back. "You shouldn't be here." His voice was barely a whisper. "You need help," she whispered, stepping closer. "No." His fingers twitched, grabbing her sleeve. His grip was ice cold. "Listen to me. You have to kill him." Her stomach dropped. "What?" His breath shuddered, like it hurt to stay alive. "He sleeps during the day." He coughed, blood dribbling from his lips. "Burn his coffin before it's too late." His hand trembled, his grip weakening. "If you don't, you will never leave." Her chest tightened. "How do you know?" Stefan's eyes closed. "Because we tried." His body went still. Lenora ran. Her hands were trembling, her heart racing. It was morning now. This was her chance. She had to find his coffin. Her legs felt like jello as she forced herself to move through the castle's twisting corridors. Lenora descended deeper, her pulse quickening as she reached the lower levels. The scent of decay filled her lungs. Then she saw it. A door sunken into the wall at the very bottom of the staircase. She pushed it open. The chamber was lined with empty coffins, their lids cracked and broken. But in the center of the room stood one coffin untouched. It was massive, its wood smooth, its edges lined with engravings that looked ancient. Her hand trembled as she grabbed a torch. A whisper slid through the air.
"Silly girl.
The Count stood in the doorway, still as death.
You disappoint me."
He murmured, stepping forward. The torch flickered in her hand. She couldn't let him get closer. With a sharp inhale, she swung the torch toward the coffin. The fire caught instantly, devouring the ancient wood in a burst of orange light. The Count screamed. He lunged toward her, but staggered mid-step, his body contorting violently, his fingers clawed at the air, his face twisting in a mix of rage and fear. The fire raged higher, spreading across the chamber walls. Lenora ran. The castle shuddered around her, the stone groaning as if the very foundation was cracking apart. She bolted up the twisting stairs, the heat of the fire chasing her. Then a new light. A thin beam of golden dawn sliced through the darkness ahead, slipping through a shattered window at the end of the hall. Lenora skidded to a stop. Behind her, the Count emerged from the fire, his body smoldering, cracking. His flesh was peeling away in strips. His voice was no longer a whisper. It was a shriek, a curse. The sunlight inched closer. He saw it and froze. For the first time, true fear filled his hollow eyes. The golden light spilled across his outstretched hand. His skin boiled, split open, turned to ash. Then the light crawled up his arm, his neck, his face, and he crumbled. His body disintegrated into dust, vanishing into the wind as if he had never been there at all. A final howl of rage echoed through the ruins, and then silence. The castle collapsed around her, flames consuming everything. She ran through the courtyard and past the rotting gates. By the time she reached the village, the castle had vanished into a heap of rubble and smoke. The village was silent. No more rats, no more sickness, No more death.